Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning until the end." God works in seasons. God works in seasons. And oftentimes what happens is we get stuck in a season and we're waiting and we're wondering what's going on. And sometimes we even question, like, God, where are you in this season? And it could be a positive thing. Maybe you've planted some seeds and you're waiting for them to grow and you're just kind of focused on them and they're not growing and they're not growing. And you're saying, God, I thought you were going to show up. I thought you were going to grow. Sometimes it's a season that's just challenging. You went to the doctor and you found out news that you didn't want to hear. So you went into the office and you got laid off and you're wondering, God, I need a job. And it's just kind of this waiting and you're waiting for this. And this verse is a reminder that God is moving in the background. That just because God is silent does not mean that God is absent. And so we find ourselves in this season, in these seasons of just waiting, wondering, sometimes we just kind of feel stuck. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today is that sometimes when you're stuck, like, what do you do? And I got to tell you, these passages kind of hit me hard this week, just knowing Southeast, because Southeast, we are a church where we get a lot of people that are coming in and for different seasons. So, for example, a few of my friends and I showed up yesterday, and we helped move a lady that was here, part of the Southeast family, for about 10 months. And we knew it going in. We knew it. She came. She said, "Hey, I'm here short term, but I want to be part of a church family." And so she got plugged in, and we ended up moving her. And she ended up moving to go be with family, and it was great. It was a place of healing for her. But it was just a season, a 10-month season of, God, where are you? And sometimes we're there. And so it might be your job, as Tommy mentioned. It might be your marriage. It might be that you're waiting for school. It might be that again, you might just feel stuck. So there's two things I want to share with you today. The first thing is that when you are in a season of waiting, when you are in a season of being stuck, you need to remember a few things. So we're going to talk about that. However, as Tommy said, and I appreciated it because it was grammar and he is right, it's a verb. If it's math, then pastors don't do math. We do grammar. and so there's things that you are doing while you are waiting. Okay, so you don't just sit down and drink coffee in a corner somewhere. No, it is an active waiting. So here's the first one. Here are the things you need to remember while waiting on God. Here's the first one. There is a natural delay. There is a natural delay between planting and harvesting. There is a natural delay between planting and harvesting. For everything, there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Again, that's how it works. We see it. I drove in this morning. Some of you saw it too as you approached the church if you were coming from the west. And what did we notice on the mountains today? The wonderful, beautiful snow. And I know that some of you are thinking, as long as it stays up there. And it's just, we recognize it here in Utah. One of the things that people love to move to Utah for is for the seasons that we go through. We have spring, we have summer and fall and winter. If you go to Missouri, you have plague and plague and plague and plague. That's just how Missouri is. It's seasons. You are in seasons. Here's another one that you need to remember. If you're going through a time of waiting, a time of being stuck, there is an unseen battle going on. There is an unseen battle going on. Look at this, Ephesians chapter 6, 6 verse 12. It says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." This was Paul's kind of concluding remarks to the church in Ephesus as he writes this letter. He says, hey, you're going to go through difficulty. Why is it that whenever you decide that you are going to take a step forward in faith, there's resistance? It's because there's a spiritual battle going on. Every week we take communion. And one of the most powerful moments of the service is when we're taking communion together. And we kind of do this thing where we stop and we posture our hearts towards God with our own relationship. And then we say, you know what? We have been loved so much by God. We have been given so much. We have been forgiven. We have been granted grace. His mercies have been poured out into our lives. And there are people around us who have never surrendered their life to Christ. And so we ask you, we say, in this moment, before we partake of this, would you just take a moment and pray for somebody that you know that needs to surrender your life? Needs to surrender their life to Christ. And time after time, I have people coming up to me and saying, Mike, you know who I'm praying for? I'm praying for my daughter. I'm praying for my dad. I'm praying for my wife. And here's what I say. I say, keep praying. Keep praying, because God's patience leads them to repentance. But here's the thing that we've got to remember. Is as much as you're praying for them to surrender their life to Christ, Satan is at work in their lives too. There's a spiritual battle going on around us. Let's not lose sight of that. Here's another thing we need to remember. God is preparing me for his blessing. God is preparing you for his blessing. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. So this is Peter writing to the church in Rome. Hey, you've been through some difficult times. Incredibly difficult seasons. I mean, we're talking about an empire that is hostile to Christianity. That said, no, you don't worship that God. Don't worship Yahweh. Instead, you need to worship the emperor. So they're feeling the pressure. They're feeling the tension. They're feeling the trials, the tribulation that they're going through. And here's what he says. So that the tested genuineness of your faith. In other words, Paul's saying this, or Peter's saying this, as you're going through these trials, it's revealing what you really believe. And here's what he says. More precious than gold that perishes through, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. The trial that you're going through, the season of waiting, the tribulation, the difficulty, ultimately there is going to be some point where that flips and God is going to be praised because of it. That's the blessing. I remember when my dad was first diagnosed with cancer, and it was hard. It was hard. I still remember the very moment that we got the phone call. We were actually out of town. We had to travel into town to be able to pick up reception. And we got the phone call that they got everything back, and this is what it looks like, and it doesn't look good. And it was pretty quick, and I'm grateful that it was quick because I don't think he would have handled COVID well. He was stubborn. He probably still is stubborn. I'm just, but here was our faith in that moment, and it was unwavering. We knew that he was going to be healed. We just knew it. And God was either going to heal him miraculously in that moment, or he was going to be healed the moment that he closed his eyes on earth and opened them in the presence of Jesus. And that's what ended up happening. And so some of you, you're saying, I'm waiting for the blessing, I'm waiting for the blessing, I'm waiting for the blessing. And I'm just here to tell you, you don't know when the blessing is going to come. That blessing might happen immediately right now, but it might not happen in this lifetime. Here's something else that you've got to remember. I'm in good company when waiting on God. I'm in good company while waiting in God. If you are going through a trial, if you are going through a tribulation, some sort of storm, and you're waiting on God to move, waiting on God to act, I want to encourage you this week to grab chapter 11 in the book of Hebrews. That's the faith chapter. It's the Hall of Fame. It kind of walks through all these kind of giants of faith in the Bible. But it starts off with this, 11:2, it says this, "Now faith is the assurance of the things hoped for the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation." In other words, they waited. It was their waiting for God to act that gave them their credentials of faith, in a sense. They were waiting for God to move. And what's amazing about it is oftentimes they never saw the blessing. And they certainly didn't see the culmination of the blessing, because while they're looking at, moving from the garden to this family in Israel down to Egypt, back into the promised land, and then into Babylon, and then eventually back, many of them never experienced anything sweet. They just were simply waiting on God. And so when you are in a season of waiting, one of the things to remember is that this is part of the Christian life. This is part of walking with God, is waiting. Okay? And here's another one that we always have to remember. God always keeps his promises. God always keeps his promises. Habakkuk 2:3 says this, "For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay." But that's a posture, as Tommy mentioned earlier, that is different from the culture that we live in. I get frustrated when my signal on my phone isn't full. Anybody else feel that frustration? When you're trying to refresh and get a score from a football game? It's nice to see a program advance when they have a bye. It's also nice to see the team down south lose to Liberty. But while you are waiting, so that's what we remember while we're waiting. What do you do while you're waiting on God now? So here's the posture of, okay, so these are the things that I'm remembering. I'm remembering these things. I'm remembering that there's a season between planting and harvesting. I'm remembering that there's a spiritual battle going all around me. I'm remembering that God is going to use us for his blessing in my life, whether it's in this life or the next life. But we're recognizing like this is part of being a Christian, is waiting on God. And we're remembering that he always keeps his promises. So here's the other thing then, is what do you do while you're waiting? Here's the first one. Write down the lessons you're learning. Write down the lessons you're learning. And I'm not really a journaler. I've kind of picked up journaling the last couple of years, but I'm not a long journaling. But here's why this is important. Look at this, Numbers 33:2. Moses wrote down their starting places, stage by stage, by command of the Lord, and these are their stages according to their starting places. Moses wrote down the journey from moving from Egypt into the promised land. Why do you think that was important? If you remember, you go back to the Old Testament and you look at that story, and God pulls him out. He's moving by a pillar of fire and a cloud, and he's bringing the Hebrews into the promised land. And as he's doing that, they get across the Red Sea, and they landed, and all of a sudden they're waiting. And when they're waiting, what happens? They turn back and they look at their old life in Egypt. And what was interesting when they looked at their old life in Egypt is they said, hey, Moses, why did you bring us out to the desert so that we could die? Remember when we were in Egypt and we sat around by the fire and we had these big pots of meat? No, they were slaves. They didn't have big pots of meat. They were told when to get up, when to go to bed. They were told what to work on that day. They were in slavery, and yet here they were in a season of waiting, and they looked back and they thought, you know what? It'd be better if we were in slavery. Because we forget so quickly where God has pulled us out of. And in this moment of waiting, we kind of let our imaginations kind of run wild. And we forget what God has done in our lives. All throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, you see over and over, remember the steadfast love of God. Remember the steadfast love of God. Remember the steadfast God of love. Remember the steadfast love of God. And the reason being is because we so quickly forget. Here's this one. Write these lessons down as I'm learning. Act as though I already have it. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Now, let me just kind of put some guardrails on this, because I think that's a verse that could get taken out of context really quickly, right? But if you look at this, Mark is talking about this. Luke actually talks about this too. So does Matthew. But asking it will be yours. Asking it will be yours. Receive. Luke actually takes it one step further, and at the end of the paragraph in Luke, he says, "Ask for the Spirit, and God will give you His Spirit." So we have all these things that you and I want. You know, we see a car or a house, or we see something on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, and we have these desires for these things. And I'm not saying that all of those things are bad. I think that some of those things can be good. But here's the bottom line, is that you and I, we need the Spirit. We need the touch of God in our lives. We need His presence. We need, I'm crucified. It's Christ who lives in me. And so when he's talking about here is act as though you already have it. Act as though you are walking in the Spirit. When God says that He will give you the Spirit, He will give you the Spirit. When God says He will give you wisdom, He will give you wisdom. When you begin to act as though you already have it. How about this one? And I think this is one of the important things. Imitate the habits that grow strong faith. Hebrews 6:11-12 says this, "And we desire that each of you to show the same earnestness, to have the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you may not be sluggish." Because I think when we're in a season of waiting, we tend to kind of get sluggish. Well, I'm waiting on God. I'm waiting on God. I'm praying it. I'm waiting on it. I'm just kind of waiting here. And what tends to happen is that we kind of put our lives on hold when we're in a season of waiting. We're not being active. And so here's the warning that he gives to him, that the author gives to him. He says, hey, we don't want you to be sluggish, but imitators, here's what we do want for you, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. So in other words, we want you to not be sluggish. Instead, imitate these people that have an active faith. And so what are those habits that people that have active faith? What are those habits that people do that have a growing faith? Here's one. Keep praying. Keep praying. Keep praying. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Keep praying. Keep serving. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Serve the Lord. Some of you are wondering, what does God want for me to do in my life? You're looking for God to, and it's like, hey, I want you to be a teacher. I want you to be a doctor. I want you to be a, whatever it is. I want you to be a preacher or a missionary or something, or I want you to write a book, or I want you to do this, and you're kind of waiting there. And you have this big picture of what God wants you to do in some big, grandiose thing, which is fantastic. I love that. But don't forget to take the trash out. Don't forget to change a light bulb. Don't forget to put your arm around somebody and say, hey, I see God at work in you. Don't forget to serve, because if you're faithful with the little things, he will give you more. How about this one? I think this is a hard one right now. I think that if you were to pick a verse that has kind of summed up the church over the last 3 years, I think it might be this one. And here's what it is. Keep on being in community. Keep on being in community. And let us consider how to stir one another one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. You have to fight to be in community. You have to fight for it. It doesn't happen naturally. We were sitting, I was talking with Betty, our sweet, sweet Betty, who's in the office. And if you haven't met Betty, raise your hand. You need to meet her. But we were talking about that. And one of the things that we love about Southeast is just how different everybody is. Everybody is so different. But you know what's hard about that? Everybody is so different. It just makes it hard. Because we all have preferences. We all have likes, we all have dislikes. We all have strong personalities, we have some with not so strong personalities. And it's hard when you're talking, when our vision, when our hope is that we would have a multi-generational church, but not just multi-generational, multiracial, not just multiracial, but economically diversity in everything. When we step back and we look at the disciples, we have Peter, who is the zealot, the one who is arguing for a nationalistic Israel. Get Rome out so that we can be blessed. And on the other hand, right next to him, you had Matthew, who I'm convinced had given up on God and had given up on his people and was a traitor as a tax collector. How would it have been to be around their campfire? I'm sure there were multiple times where one got up and walked away. And I'm sure there were other times where the sons of thunder had to break a fight apart. But it's worth it. It's worth it because. When Jesus goes to the cross, before he goes to the cross, he eats the Last Supper, and then he's teaching his disciples some lessons. And here's what he kind of said to them as he was praying for the disciples. He prayed this. He said, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me. For you and me. So not only these disciples, but he's also praying for us, for those who will believe in me. And this is what he prays. He says, through their word, he says, that they may be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you. And they may also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Did you catch that? Our unity as a church, as Christians, believers across the world, our unity is the testimony to the world that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the Messiah. That's our testimony. A lot of us think, man, if we just have the right sermon series, if we just have the right songs, if we just have the right podcasts, if we just have the right building, if we just have the right, all that stuff is good. But that's not winning people to Christ. What wins people to Christ is unity. And when people come in and they go, hey, I can resonate with that guy, or I can resonate with that lady. I can resonate, man, it's so different here. You know, you go out into the world and everybody's kind of in their own little camps. But I go to that church and there's one camp. And it's the camp of the Messiah, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. But here's the thing is it's hard. And you got to fight for it. And I think that it's easy to just say, you know what? I'm going to drift off and I'm not going to meet together. And look at what he says here. He says, as is the habit of some. So just as we make it a habit to come together, to gather, to worship together, to be in community with one another, to be in groups and on ministry teams together, as we make it a habit to do those things, it can also become a habit to walk away. It can also be a habit to walk away. So we've got to be careful. We got to be careful. Keep on, so as you're waiting, keep on being in community. How about this one? Keep on sowing. Ecclesiastes 11:6. In the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, whether both alike will be good. I get asked a question, and I never know how to answer it. And I understand, like, it's good chit-chat. But I really have no idea how to answer this. And the question is how's church? That's a weird question in some ways. Like, how's your family? Good, I guess. Like, we still eat together. Love Jesus, love my wife. That's good, right? Like, that's, you know, but most of the time when people are looking and they ask that question, they're asking three things, right? The ABCs, adults, baptisms, and contributions, right? That's what people ask when they ask that question. And I don't really know how to answer that. I think I'm going to start answering it this way, as I just realized this now as I'm talking. Faithful. Southeast is faithful. How's your church faithful? And I don't know. I've always said that a church is too big when you can't know anybody in the congregation. And a church is too small when there's no outreach happening. And what I love about right now in this season of Southeast, I was talking with an individual who used to be on staff. Some of you know him. He preached a couple months ago for me, Scott Roderick. And he said, man, Mike, I've never seen Southeast outreach as much as they do right now. You guys are doing so much for the kingdom. And I was out here I was out at the clothing closet a couple months ago, and this car drove through the neighborhood, and they stopped, and they said, hey, what's going on now? And we explained it, and the lady that was driving said, man, we always see you guys doing stuff out there, whether it's church on the lawn or the food bank and clothing closet or drive-through prayer or some other stuff. Like, we are in a season of outreach, and I really like that. It's really amazing. However, the other thing too, and this is amazing also, like, we put a huge emphasis on getting involved in a group, getting involved in a Bible study, getting involved, getting connected. And I think it's pretty cool. We have, just on Sunday mornings, we have about 3/4 of the people that are here on a Sunday morning are in Bible studies following the worship service. That's pretty impressive when you start to look at it. And then you think about how many groups we have going on throughout the week. So when we step back and we look and we say, well, how's Southeast doing? And I think, well, we're faithfully outreach and we're getting to know each other. That's cool. So thank you, because it's the body building the body up in love. Keep on sowing. We don't know what God is going to do. And here's this one: keep on believing. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it. This is Paul writing to Timothy. And this season in Paul's life, he was probably recognizing that he was not going to live much longer on this earth. And so he's writing to this young evangelist who probably would have been around 40 years old. He says, Timothy, I know all the trials and tribulations you're going to go through. Don't forget who you believe in. And as you're waiting on God to move, I just want to encourage you, don't forget who you're believing in. You're not believing in yourself to overcome mountains. You're believing in the one who can move mountains. And then finally, it's trust God instead of panicking. Trust God instead of panicking. Psalm 56:3 through 4 says this: when I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? What can flesh do to me? So while you're waiting, trust God instead of panicking. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up, and we're going to sing, and then we're going to receive communion together. We're going to break bread together. We're going to have our meal. But as they're coming, here was the thing, and I don't know, this just kind of struck me kind of last night as I was thinking through the sermon, walking through it. A lot of times we're waiting on God, right? We're waiting on God. And here was my thought. What if God is waiting on you? Just what if God is waiting on you? This is one of my favorite passages in the New Testament. Romans chapter 2, it says this: or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? See, I know there's a few of you in this room and are watching online that have never surrendered your life to Christ. And what's amazing about it is that God's patience is leading you to repentance. Later on in Scriptures, it says that God wishes that all people to be saved, that none would perish. And I just want to encourage you, if you've never surrendered your life to Christ, what are you waiting for? Why haven't you surrendered your life to Christ? He's waiting for you to do it. He never forces anybody. He's just waiting. And his patience with us is incredible.